Be me, Ingrid, 32 years old, married to Bernard for 6 years, together for 8. He's honestly a good guy, works in IT, makes decent money, helps around the house. But lately, I've been seeing things differently. My friend circle has been opening my eyes to a lot of problematic behaviors I never noticed. Bernard does this thing where he mansplains technology to me. Like last week, I was trying to fix the printer and he came over and just started doing it himself. Didn't even ask if I wanted help, just assumed I couldn't handle it. When I pointed this out, he looked confused and said, I was just trying to help. Classic deflection. Or how he always assumes I'll handle the social calendar. His mom's birthday, planning dinner with friends, remembering anniversaries. It's called emotional labor, and women have been doing it for free for centuries. When I brought this up, he said, but you're so much better at that stuff than me. Another way of saying women are naturally suited for unpaid domestic work. My friends Jessica, Monica, and Lisa have been really supportive. We meet every Thursday for wine and discuss these issues. They've helped me realize how many microaggressions I deal with daily. Jessica went through her own awakening last year and left her husband Richard. She's so much happier now, living her authentic truth. Bernard also does this thing where he interrupts me during conversations. Not constantly, but enough that I've started noticing the pattern. Last month at his friend's barbecue, he cut me off while I was explaining sustainable farming practices. His friend Kevin actually seemed interested in what I was saying, but Bernard jumped in with some joke about how I'm trying to convert everyone to organic everything, undermining my expertise and making me look like some kind of zealot. The final straw was the dishwasher incident. I had specifically asked him to load it a certain way so the dishes get cleaner. Came home from work and he had done it, his way again. When I explained the science behind proper dish placement, he rolled his eyes. Actually rolled his eyes at me, like my knowledge and preferences don't matter. Jessica said something that really resonated with me. Ingrid, you're allowing yourself to be diminished in your own home. She's right. I have a bachelor's degree in environmental science and years of experience in project management, yet I'm being treated like my opinions are cute little suggestions. Monica pointed out that I'm still young enough to start over. Lots of women leave marriages in their 30s and find much better partners, men who actually respect their intelligence and contributions. Why should I settle for someone who clearly doesn't value what I bring to the relationship? Spent 3 months documenting these patterns. Every interruption, every assumption, every dismissive comment. Presented Bernard with a comprehensive list during what I called a relationship audit. Told him these behaviors needed to change, or I couldn't continue. He seemed genuinely shocked, kept saying he had no idea I felt this way, promised to work on everything, but I could tell he didn't really get it. The fact that he was surprised by basic relationship inequities just proved how oblivious he was. Lisa made an excellent point about how emotional labor extends beyond just calendar management. I'm constantly managing his feelings, making sure he's comfortable, anticipating his needs. Meanwhile, he barely notices when I'm stressed about work or family issues. Classic example of male privilege, expecting to be centered in every interaction. Gave him 6 months to show meaningful improvement. He tried, I'll give him that. Started asking before helping with technical problems. Made an effort to remember social obligations. But it felt performative, like he was checking boxes rather than fundamentally understanding. The breaking point came when he planned a surprise weekend trip for our anniversary. Booked. This cabin in the mountains without asking about my preferences. Just assumed I'd want what he wanted. When I explained that surprising someone isn't romantic if you don't consider their actual interests. He got defensive and said he was trying to do something nice. That's when I realized he would never truly evolve. Jessica had warned me about this. Men can modify behaviors temporarily, but rarely change their core mindset. I deserved better than someone who needed constant instruction on basic respect. Filed for divorce in March. Bernard was devastated, kept asking if we could try counseling. But why should I have to pay someone to teach my husband how to value me? The fact that he needed professional help to understand basic equality just reinforced my decision. Jessica threw me a liberation party after the papers were finalized. Felt amazing to be free from constantly educating someone about their privilege. Finally had space to focus on my own growth and goals. Started dating, again with much higher standards. Thought I'd have no trouble finding someone better. I'm educated, financially stable, interesting, and not bad looking. Figured there had to be plenty of emotionally intelligent men out there, men who had already done the work on themselves. First few dates were disasters. Matched with this guy Arthur on an app seemed promising from his profile, but within 20 minutes of meeting him, it was clear he had the same issues as Bernard. Kept steering conversation back to his job, his hobbies, his opinions. When I mentioned the nonprofit work I do, he barely asked any follow-up questions. Coffee date with someone named Aaron was even worse. Actually used the phrase, "I'm not like other guys." Red flag central. Then spent an hour explaining cryptocurrency while I sat there watching him mansplain economics. Like I don't understand basic financial concepts. Started to worry that maybe the dating pool was more limited than I'd assumed. But Lisa reminded me that quality is more important than quantity. Better to be alone than to settle for another mediocre partner. Meanwhile, Bernard seemed to be doing fine. Mutual friends mentioned he was dating someone new, some woman named Emma who worked at the library. Good for him, I guess. Hope he doesn't repeat the same patterns. My dating life got progressively more frustrating. Every man I met seemed to have the same entitled attitudes. Talking over me, assuming they knew better, expecting emotional caretaking. Started wondering if the problem was more systemic than individual. 6 months after the divorce, ran into Bernard at the grocery store. He looked happy, actually glowing, which was annoying. Introduced me to Emma, who seemed pleasant enough. They were buying ingredients for dinner together, very domestic. Emma was definitely not what I'd expected. Quiet, kind of traditional seeming. The type who probably doesn't challenge anyone about anything. Exactly the kind of enabling partner that allows men to stay comfortable in their privilege. Couldn't help but notice how Bernard looked at her. Same way he used to look at me early in our relationship. Before I started holding him accountable for his behavior. Clearly he'd learned nothing and just found someone who wouldn't push back. Jessica reminded me that men often rebound with women who represent everything their ex-wife wasn't. It's a way of rejecting the growth they were asked to do. Probably chose Emma specifically because she wouldn't demand the same level of awareness I did. Dating continued to be disappointing. Started to suspect that men were put off by my confidence and standards. They'd seem interested initially, but then fade when they realized I wasn't going to be the cool girl who laughed off their problematic comments. Had a particularly bad experience with someone named Brandon. Seemed progressive on paper, worked for an environmental consulting firm, but turned out to have deeply ingrained sexist assumptions. When I ordered for myself at dinner, he looked surprised. Apparently expected me to need guidance choosing from the menu. Monica suggested I might be coming on too strong. Maybe save the deeper conversations about equality for later dates. But why should I have to hide my values to make men comfortable? If they can't handle discussing basic respect from the beginning, they're not worth my time. 1.5 years post-divorce, Bernard got engaged. Mutual friend Jennifer mentioned it casually, like it wasn't a big deal. Apparently, he proposed at the same restaurant where we had our first date, which felt unnecessarily symbolic, but whatever. Couldn't help but feel a little bitter about the timeline. Here I was, still struggling to find anyone worth a second date, while he'd managed to find someone willing to commit within 18 months. Obviously, Emma had much lower standards than I did. Started therapy to work through some of these feelings. Therapist suggested that perhaps my approach to relationships needed examination, but she clearly didn't understand the reality of dating as an empowered woman. Ended up switching to someone who specialized in feminist therapy. Dating apps became increasingly frustrating. Every profile was either overtly problematic or subtly so. Guys posting gym selfies, talking about loving adventure and travel. Code words for masculine validation and privilege. Had coffee with someone named Michael who seemed different. Worked in social services, claimed to be an ally. But when I mentioned my divorce, he immediately wanted to know what went wrong. When I explained about Bernard's inability to recognize his privilege, Michael got defensive. Started arguing that maybe I'd been too harsh. asked if I'd tried communicating my needs more clearly. That's when I realized Michael was exhibiting the exact same patterns, immediately centering the man's perspective, questioning my judgment, assuming that relationship problems must somehow be the woman's fault. Classic gaslighting disguised as reasonable discourse. Told him exactly what I thought about his response, explained how his immediate defense of a man he'd never met revealed his own biases, pointed out that his suggestions about communication implied I hadn't been clear enough, which was patronizing and dismissive. Michael's face changed completely. Suddenly, he wasn't the sensitive ally he'd pretended to be. Started raising his voice, saying I was being unreasonable, accused me of having a victim complex and being impossible to please. "You probably destroyed that poor guy for no reason," he said. "Men like Bernard sound like they were actually trying. Maybe if you spent less time looking for problems, you'd actually be happy." Couldn't believe he was attacking me for having standards. Told him he was proving my point about male entitlement. He laughed and said, "Good luck finding anyone willing to deal with your attitude." Then left me sitting there alone in the coffee shop. Similar patterns started happening with other men. Whenever they learned about my divorce, the conversation shifted. Suddenly, they became experts on my marriage and what went wrong. All of them immediately sympathetic to Bernard, despite knowing nothing about him. Met someone named James at a community event. Seemed promising initially, worked for a local advocacy organization. But when the topic of my past relationships came up, same thing happened. Immediately started questioning my decision to leave. Asked what specific things Bernard had done that were so terrible. When I explained about the emotional labor and microaggressions, James actually laughed out loud, said it sounded like normal relationship friction, told me most women would be grateful for a husband who helped around the house and had a stable job. "You threw away a marriage over him helping with the printer?" he asked incredulously. "And planning a surprise trip? These are the complaints of a spoiled woman." His whole demeanor had changed from interested to contemptuous. Tried to explain the larger patterns of dismissiveness and assumption, but James just shook his head like I was speaking nonsense. "Ingrid, you sound exhausting to be married to. Poor Bernard probably walked on eggshells trying not to trigger your next lecture." Couldn't believe how quickly he'd turned on me. Told him his response was exactly the kind of dismissive attitude I'd been talking about. He rolled his eyes and said, "There you go again, making everything about feminism. Maybe if you focused more on being a good partner and less on being right all the time, you'd still be married." That conversation haunted me for weeks. Started second-guessing whether my complaints about Bernard had been valid. But then Jessica reminded me that men always protect each other. They can't admit that one of them might have been wrong because it threatens the whole system. 2 years post-divorce, learned that Bernard and Emma had bought a house. The same neighborhood where Bernard and I used to talk about eventually moving. Felt like salt in the wound, especially since my own living situation was still unstable. Renting a one-bedroom apartment while he was building a life with someone else. Started to wonder if Emma was really as wonderful as everyone claimed, or if she was just willing to accept things I wouldn't tolerate. Probably saw his occasional helpful gestures as romantic instead of recognizing the underlying patterns. Had another disastrous dating experience with someone named Robert. Lawyer, seemed sophisticated and aware. But when he learned about my divorce, immediately became hostile. Wanted to know every detail about what Bernard had supposedly done wrong. When I explained about the interrupting and assumption making, Robert became visibly angry. "You destroyed a marriage because your husband interrupted you sometimes? Do you have any idea how many women would love to have a devoted partner who occasionally cuts them off in conversation?" Tried to explain that it wasn't about individual incidents, but larger patterns. Robert wasn't having it. "Ingrid, you sound like someone who was looking for reasons to be unhappy. Men aren't perfect. We make mistakes. That doesn't mean we're oppressing you." The conversation escalated quickly. Robert started listing all the things Bernard had probably done right. Working, contributing financially, helping with housework, planning romantic gestures. And you threw it all away because he didn't load the dishwasher to your exact specifications. You know what I think happened? Robert continued. You think you got influenced by a bunch of miserable feminists who convinced you that being married to a good man was somehow degrading. Now you're alone and bitter trying to justify your terrible decision. Told him he was way out of line and didn't know anything about my marriage. But Robert kept going. Bernard dodged a bullet. He's probably thanking his lucky stars every day that he's with Emma instead of someone who turned every interaction into a political statement. Left the bar feeling shaken. These men were so quick to defend someone they'd never met, while completely dismissing my lived experience. Proved that the problem was definitely systemic. Year 3 of being divorced, Bernard and Emma got married. Small ceremony, apparently. Just family and close friends. Jennifer showed me pictures because she thought I'd want to see. They looked genuinely happy together, which was somehow the worst part. Emma wore a simple dress, nothing fancy or attention-seeking. Exactly the kind of woman who probably never challenges anything. Bernard looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in years, clearly thriving with someone who didn't demand growth or awareness. Started to feel like maybe I'd made a mistake. Not about leaving necessarily, but about my expectations. Maybe perfect partnership doesn't exist, and I'd let the perfect become the enemy of the good. Decided to give dating one more serious try. Matched with someone named Daniel, who seemed different. Older, divorced himself, claimed to understand the complexities of relationships. Agreed to meet for dinner at a nice restaurant. Conversation started well, lots of common interests. But when he asked about my marriage, the familiar pattern emerged. As soon as I mentioned leaving Bernard over communication issues and emotional labor, Daniel's expression changed completely. "Wait, let me get this straight," he said. "You left your husband because he helped with tech problems without being asked? And planned a surprise trip? And sometimes interrupted you?" His voice was getting louder, attracting attention from other tables. Tried to explain the complexity of the situation, but Daniel was already committed to his narrative. "Ingrid, I've been divorced too, and I can tell you that what you're describing isn't abuse. It's not even neglect. It sounds like normal human behavior." The lecture continued for 20 minutes. Daniel explaining everything that was wrong with my perspective, how I'd been brainwashed by radical feminism, how I'd destroyed a perfectly good marriage over petty complaints. "You know what the tragedy is?" Daniel asked. "There's some poor bastard out there married to a woman who actually cheats, or drinks, or refuses to work. And you had a faithful husband who worked hard and tried to make you happy, and you threw it away because he wasn't perfectly calibrated to your constantly changing demands." Tried to defend myself, but Daniel wasn't finished. "Bernard is remarried now, right? To someone who appreciates him? That should tell you everything you need to know about who the problem was. Emma probably thanks her lucky stars every day that she found a good man who was done wasting time on ungrateful women. Couldn't take any more of his judgment and vitriol. Told him the date was over and started to leave. But Daniel followed me to the parking lot, still lecturing about my entitlement and poor judgment. "You're going to end up alone, Ingrid," he called after me, "because no decent man wants to walk into the minefield of dating someone who destroyed her last relationship over nothing. We all talk, you know. Word gets around about women like you." Drove home feeling completely defeated. Started to wonder if every man I'd encounter would have the same reaction. Maybe I really had made a terrible mistake. Maybe Bernard really was as good as it gets. Few months later, ran into Bernard and Emma at a farmer's market. They were buying vegetables together, Emma laughing at something he'd said. Looked like the kind of easy, comfortable relationship I'd thought was impossible. Bernard seemed lighter somehow, less worried about saying the wrong thing. Emma was exactly what I'd expected. Sweet, agreeable, the type who probably never had strong opinions about dishwasher loading. He probably thought Bernard's technological helpfulness was charming, and appreciated his surprise trips instead of analyzing them for hidden assumptions. Couldn't help but approach them to say hello. Conversation was awkward but civil. Bernard seemed genuinely happy, asked about my work and living situation. Emma was polite but clearly wanted to move along. "We should get going," Emma said after a few minutes. "Bernard's making dinner tonight, and we still need to pick up wine." Domestic bliss on full display. Everything I'd rejected, they'd embraced. Watching them walk away together, I felt a crushing wave of regret. Maybe all those men were right. Maybe I had thrown away something precious over trivial complaints. Maybe the problem really was my impossibly high standards and constant criticism. Started thinking about all the good things Bernard had done. Brought me coffee in bed on weekends. Remembered my work deadlines and asked how projects were going. Never complained when I wanted to spend time with friends. Was faithful, responsible, and genuinely cared about my happiness. The issues I'd focused on suddenly seemed so small. Interrupting occasionally, making assumptions about help, planning surprises without consultation. Normal human flaws that I'd magnified into relationship-ending problems, while completely taking for granted all his positive qualities. Jessica tried to remind me that I'd made the right decision, but even she seemed less convinced than before. Monica had actually started dating someone who exhibited many of the same behaviors I'd criticized in Bernard, but she seemed happy enough. Realized that my friends had been dealing with their own disappointments and regrets. Maybe their advice had been more about validating their own choices than helping me. Misery loves company, and divorced women supporting each other's decisions regardless of merit. Year 4 of being alone, started seeing a different therapist. Dr. Rachel, who asked harder questions about my decision-making process. Wanted to know if I'd ever tried to address issues with Bernard before making ultimatums. Whether I'd considered the possibility that relationships require compromise from both people. Gradually started to acknowledge that maybe I hadn't been the perfect partner either. I'd been quick to criticize and slow to appreciate. Focused on Bernard's shortcomings while taking his strengths for granted. Expected him to anticipate my needs while rarely asking about his. The more honest I became about my role in our marriage's failure, the more crushing the regret became. Bernard really had been trying to make me happy, and I'd responded by keeping score of every perceived slight. Started having fantasies about reaching out to apologize. Maybe explaining that I'd been going through something and hadn't been thinking clearly. But Bernard was married now, building a life with someone who actually valued him. Contacting him would be selfish and disruptive. My dating life remained a disaster. Every man I met either became hostile when they learned about my divorce, or revealed the same entitled attitudes that had driven me crazy about Bernard. Except now those behaviors seemed almost quaint compared to actual red flags like anger issues or financial irresponsibility. Met someone named Kevin at a work conference. Successful, intelligent, seemed emotionally mature. But when the topic of past relationships came up, same pattern. Immediately wanted to dissect my decision to leave Bernard. "Let me understand this," Kevin said. "You had a husband who worked, helped around the house, planned romantic gestures, and was faithful. But you left him because he wasn't feminist enough?" The contempt in his voice was unmistakable. When I tried to explain the nuances, Kevin cut me off. "Ingrid, I've heard this story before from other divorced women. You all have the same complaints about perfectly decent men. Meanwhile, you're single, in your mid-30s, wondering why you can't find anyone better." The conversation turned into a full-scale assault on my character. Kevin explaining how my generation of women had been poisoned by unrealistic expectations, how we'd been convinced that marriage was supposed to be a constant validation of our feminist ideals, rather than a partnership between two imperfect people trying to build something together. "Bernard probably spent years walking on eggshells," Kevin said, never knowing which innocent comment or helpful gesture would trigger your next lecture about privilege. "Emma probably makes him feel like a good man instead of a constant disappointment." Couldn't deny that there was truth in what he was saying. I had been quick to find fault and slow to express gratitude. Had turned our home into a place where Bernard felt criticized rather than appreciated, while convincing myself that I was just holding him accountable. Kevin wasn't finished with his assessment. You know what's really tragic? You probably destroyed Bernard's confidence for years. Made him feel like everything he did was wrong, like he was fundamentally flawed. Thank God he found Emma and remembered what it feels like to be valued. Left that conversation feeling completely broken. Started to see my behavior during the marriage in a new light. The constant corrections, the lists of improvements, the dismissive responses to his efforts. I'd been so focused on being right that I'd forgotten to be kind. Began to understand why every man I met reacted the same way to my divorce story. They saw someone who had thrown away something precious, who had prioritized ideology over love, who had chosen to be right over being happy. Bernard and Emma had their first child last spring. Jennifer mentioned it casually, probably not realizing how much it would affect me. They'd named the baby Grace, apparently Emma's grandmother's name. Everything I could have had if I'd been able to appreciate what I had. Started to imagine the life I'd thrown away. Sunday mornings with Bernard and our children, family vacations, holiday traditions, growing old together, all sacrificed because I couldn't tolerate minor imperfections in communication style. The regret became overwhelming. Every night, lying alone in my apartment, wondering if Bernard ever thought about our marriage, if he was grateful for Emma's acceptance of his human flaws, realized that my friends had been wrong about everything. There wasn't a better man waiting for me. Bernard had been the best I was likely to find, and I'd systematically destroyed his love through constant criticism and impossible standards. Now I'm 36, completely alone, with no prospects. Every man I meet either becomes immediately hostile when they learn about my divorce, or reveals themselves to be actually problematic in ways that make Bernard's minor flaws seem insignificant. Bernard is thriving with a woman who appreciates him, building the family and future I could have shared, while I sit in my empty apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of my own poor judgment. The worst part is knowing that I did this to myself. Convinced by friends who were dealing with their own regrets, blinded by ideology that prioritized being right over being loved, too proud to appreciate a good man's genuine efforts. Sometimes I drive by their house just to torture myself. See Bernard playing in the yard with Grace while Emma watches from the porch. The picture of domestic happiness that I rejected in favor of being perpetually dissatisfied. Know that I'll probably spend the rest of my life alone, paying the price for my entitlement and ingratitude, while Bernard enjoys the love and appreciation I was too foolish to give him. Wish I could go back and tell my younger self to stop keeping score, to focus on Bernard's many good qualities instead of his minor imperfections, to choose gratitude over grievance. But it's too late now. Bernard has moved on to someone who deserves him, while I'm left with nothing but crushing regret and the knowledge that I destroyed my own happiness through my insufferable need to be perpetually vindicated instead of simply loved.